On a serene autumn morning in a remote Siberian village, the joyful sounds of children playing in a schoolyard were shattered by an unimaginable tragedy. In an instant, nature's unforgiving power descended, leaving a close-knit community in shock and mourning the loss of its most vulnerable members. What happened on October 29, 2024, remains heartbreaking and deeply unsettling. Join us as we delve into the haunting events of that fateful day and the lingering questions that continue to demand answers. The forest surrounding the village, nestled deep in the Siberian wilderness, had always been quiet. On October 29, 2024, that silence was shattered. The morning had been unusually warm for late autumn, the air crisp but not biting. Children from the village's small school spilled into the schoolyard during recess, their laughter rising against the distant hum of the forest. The creature emerged silently, a shadow at the edge of the clearing. A massive grizzly, its fur matted with dirt, moved toward the chain-link fence that separated the schoolyard from the wilderness. It took its time, sniffing the air. The animal was watching the cluster of children closely. Then, with a burst of power, it lunged at the fence, sending a shudder through the flimsy barrier. Alyosha, the first child to notice, froze mid-step, his face pale with fear. Others turned to look. Confusion quickly turned to panic. A teacher standing near the playground's edge shouted a warning, her voice sharp and piercing. The children scattered, their high-pitched screams slicing through the air as they ran toward the school building. But the bear breached the fence with terrifying ease. The rusted metal buckled under its weight, collapsing in a tangle that barely slowed its momentum. It charged forward, each step pounding the earth with a brutal rhythm. It was massive, a living tank of muscle and claw, moving with a speed that belied its size, and it wanted nothing more than to attack. The first child it reached was Alyosha. He had tripped in the chaos, landing hard on the dirt. The bear swiped at him with a single paw, the blow sending the boy sprawling. Blood sprayed in an arc as the claws tore through his back, the sharp tang of it filling the air. The bear reared up, roaring, its guttural sound loud enough to rattle windows. Teachers raced forward, their faces pale with terror. One grabbed a stick, wielding it like a weapon, while another screamed for the children to enter. The bear turned on them, its eyes wild, its movements feral and erratic. It charged again, slamming into a small wooden play structure which splintered under its weight. A teacher stumbled backward, her foot catching on the debris as the bear descended on another child, a boy named Mikhail. The boy, no more than 8, tried to crawl away. The bear caught him by the leg, dragging him back with an almost lazy swipe. Its jaws snapped down, crushing his little torso in a spray of blood. Mikhail's screams choked into silence as the bear shook him like a rag doll. Other children had managed to make it inside the school, but the bear's focus was relentless. It barreled toward the remaining group of children, still scrambling to safety, its claws raking the earth as it lunged forward. Natasha, a 9-year-old girl, fell just feet from the door, her small hands clutching at the steps. The bear reached her in 2 strides, its paw slamming down on her back with a sickening crunch. Inside the building, chaos reigned. Teachers pulled sobbing children into classrooms, locking doors and dragging desks to create makeshift barricades. One teacher frantically dialed for help on her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm and detached, but the reality outside was anything but. Undeterred by the fleeing children, the bear turned on a group of teachers who had rushed to shield the last students. One of them, Lev, a wiry man with a rake in hand, was guarding 2 little girls, twins. Lev swung wildly at the animal. The rake glanced off its head, barely phasing it. With a low growl, the bear charged, knocking Lev to the ground. But it didn't stop. The twins, little Nadia and Tatiana, were its real target. In an instant, it pinned them both with its massive paws and tore into them with a ferocity that froze the others in place. A sharp crack split the air, followed by another. A pair of hunters, alerted by the commotion, had arrived on the scene, their rifles aimed and ready. The first shot struck the bear in the shoulder, causing it to stagger. It roared in defiance, a guttural mix of pain and rage. The second shot hit its flank, but the beast refused to go down. The bear turned on the hunters, its movements slower now, but no less determined. It charged toward them, its massive frame kicking up dirt and debris. One of the hunters fired again, the bullet striking just above the bear's right eye. The animal stumbled mid-stride, its body jerking awkwardly before collapsing onto its side. It let out one final ragged breath before falling still. The schoolyard was silent except for the distant wails of sirens and the muffled sobs of children inside the building. The bear's lifeless form lay amidst the wreckage of the yard, its fur matted with blood, its body a gruesome reminder of the violence that had unfolded. By the time authorities arrived, the scene was one of devastation. 5 children lay dead, their small bodies crumpled in the dirt where they had fallen. Teachers huddled inside the building, their faces streaked with tears, their hands bloodied from useless attempts to save the children. The hunters stood near the bear's body, their faces grim, their rifles still in hand. In the following days, the village grappled with the horror of what had occurred. Questions arose. Why had the bear wandered so close to the school? Why had it attacked with such unrelenting aggression? Wildlife experts speculated that the unusually warm weather had disrupted the bear's hibernation cycle, driving it out of the forest for food. Others blamed deforestation, claiming that the bear's habitat had been encroached upon, forcing it into closer contact with humans. But for the villagers, these explanations offered little solace. The scars left by the attack, both physical and emotional, would take far longer to heal. The once innocent sound of children laughing in the schoolyard was now a painful reminder of lives cut tragically short. And though the bear had been killed, its memory lingered like a shadow over the village, a stark reminder of the thin line between nature and civilization. The lake was still, its surface glassy under the pale light of an overcast afternoon. Tom and his 11-year-old son, Evan, sat on the edge of their small aluminum boat, the boy reeling in a modest catch while his father cleaned the morning's haul. The air smelled faintly of pine and strongly of fish, and the only sounds were the lapping of water against the hull and the occasional cry of a distant bird. It felt serene, almost idyllic. Tom had always wanted to take Evan on a fishing trip to Alaska, but the boy had been too small and frail. Now, at 11 years old, Evan was a strong boy with a good head on his shoulders. Tom knew his son could appreciate the beauty of the wilderness and learn a thing or two about nature. But then, everything changed. They were on their boat, gleefully chatting. Tom noticed the bear first. It appeared on the shoreline, a hulking mass of brown fur and raw power. It stood still, its head low as it sniffed the air, drawn by the smell of fresh fish. The boat was anchored about 30 yards from shore, but the distance offered little comfort. Tom's stomach knotted. Grizzlies weren't uncommon in this part of Alaska, but a curious bear was one thing. An aggressive one was another. The bear moved closer to the water's edge, its massive paws sinking into the muddy bank. Tom gestured to Evan to stay quiet, his mind racing through their options. They could row back to the opposite side of the lake, but the bear was already fixated on them, its eyes locked onto the boat. Evan's fishing rod dipped, the line snapping taut as he hooked a fish. The sound of the reel spinning seemed to irritate the bear. It let out a low growl. A deep sound carried across the water. Tom's hands trembled as he grabbed the oars. He didn't need to tell Evan to reel in the line. The boy had already abandoned the rod, his eyes wide with fear. The bear entered the water, wading in with slow, deliberate steps. Its fur rippled with each movement, and the lake's surface shuddered around it. Tom began rowing, each pull of the oars frantic and uneven. The boat lurched forward, but needed to be quicker. The bear's pace quickened, its bulk moving unnervingly through the shallows. Evan clung to the side of the boat, his knuckles white. Tom threw one of the fish he had cleaned into the water, hoping to distract the animal. The fish landed with a splash, and for a moment, the bear paused. It sniffed the air again, its gaze shifting between the floating fish and the boat. But the reprieve was brief. The bear ignored the fish and surged forward, its powerful strokes cutting through the water like a knife. Its eyes were on the bigger prize. The first swipe came without warning. The bear rose onto its hind legs, its massive paw slamming against the boat's side. The impact rocked the vessel violently, sending water sloshing over the edge. Evan screamed, clutching at his father as the ship tilted dangerously. Tom shouted for him to stay low, his voice barely audible over his heart pounding. Tom grabbed another fish and hurled it toward the bear, then another, his hands slick with blood and water. The bear growled, its mouth pulling back to reveal yellow teeth, but it was undeterred. Another swipe cracked the side of the boat, leaving deep gouges in the aluminum. The vessel tipped, and Tom knew they had seconds before it capsized. The bear lunged again, catching the boat's edge and flipping it with a furious twist. Tom and Evan plunged into the icy water, the cold stealing their breath. Tom surfaced first, gasping, his hands frantically searching for his son. Evan appeared a few feet away, his eyes wide with terror. Tom bellowed at Evan to swim. The bear was thrashing toward them. Its claws churned the lake into a froth, its growls muffled but no less terrifying. Tom spotted a rocky outcrop jutting from the water about 20 feet away. It was their only chance. He swam toward Evan, grabbing the boy's arm and pulling him alongside. The weight of his soaked clothes dragged at him, his muscles burning with each stroke, but he didn't stop. Behind them, the bear closed the distance, its massive head cutting through the water relentlessly. Tom's foot hit something solid, the rocks. He shoved Evan forward, urging him to climb. The boy scrambled onto the slippery surface, his fingers clawing for purchase. Tom followed, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he hauled himself up just as the bear reached the base of the outcrop. The bear reared up on its hind legs, swiping at the rocks. Its claws scraped against the stone, sending splinters of rock flying. Evan pressed himself against his father, his small frame shaking with fear. Tom scanned their surroundings, searching desperately for anything they could use to defend themselves. There was nothing, just water and stone. The bear roared, reverberating in Tom's chest like a drumbeat. It tried to climb, its claws gouging into the rock, but the surface was too steep and slick. Still, it didn't retreat. It circled the outcrop, pacing, growling, its dark eyes fixed on them. Time passed in agonizing increments. Tom held Evan close, their bodies trembling from the cold and adrenaline. Every sound, the rustle of wind, the ripple of water, felt amplified, each one a reminder of how close they had come to death. Finally, a distant noise broke through the tension, the whine of an engine growing louder. Tom turned, spotting a small boat cutting across the lake. Rescue. He waved his arms, shouting, his voice raw. The bear growled again but began to retreat, sensing the approach of humans. It waded back into the forest, its massive form vanishing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. The rescue team pulled them from the outcrop, their faces pale with shock at the scene. Tom and Evan sat huddled together, their bodies shaking from the cold and the sheer magnitude of what they had survived. That night, as they wrapped themselves in blankets by the fire, the bear's roar echoed in their memories. The lake was silent again, but the peace it once held was shattered forever. The wind cut across the frozen expanse of Hudson Bay, biting and sharp. Dr. Laura adjusted her hood, her breath visible in the freezing air as she studied the shifting ice. Her team moved around her, cataloging samples, taking measurements, and noting the subtle changes in the Arctic's fragile ecosystem. The silence of the wilderness was heavy, broken only by the crunch of boots and the distant groan of ice plates shifting against one another. That afternoon, they saw something that gave them pause. At first, it was a speck on the horizon, seemingly moving with purpose over the jagged ice. They thought it was an illusion, a trick of light and ice for a while. As it came closer, though, Laura recognized the unmistakable shape of a polar bear. Its massive body was worn, its ribs visible even through thick fur. This was no idle wanderer, a predator pushed to the brink. Desperate, the team froze as the bear approached, its black eyes locked onto the camp. Laura's instincts kicked in, and she grabbed the flare gun from her belt. With a sharp trigger pull, a red streak shot into the air, hissing and crackling. The bear stopped, startled, its ears flattening against its head. For a moment, she thought it might retreat. It didn't. Instead, it circled wide around the camp, pacing just beyond the range of their defenses. The bear's movements were deliberately calculated. This was an exquisite hunter at work. It stopped, sniffed the air every few minutes, and edged closer. The scent of food, of humans, drew it forward. Laura barked orders, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. The team scrambled to pack what they could, abandoning their research to retreat to the emergency shelter, a reinforced structure designed to withstand the Arctic's harshest elements. They moved quickly, hauling essential gear inside as the bear stalked closer. The shelter was small but sturdy, with thick metal panels insulated against the cold. Laura bolted the door as the last team member rushed inside, her heart pounding. Through a narrow slit of reinforced glass, she watched the bear approach the abandoned camp. It tore into their equipment with brutal efficiency. Tents collapsed under the weight of its massive paws. Storage crates splintered as it clawed through them, scattering supplies across the ice. The bear's frustration grew as it found nothing substantial to eat. It roared, the sound deep and guttural, reverberating through the shelter like a physical force. Inside, the team huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. Hours passed, but the bear showed no signs of leaving. It circled the shelter, its claws scratching against the metal walls. Laura tried to calm them, but the bear's relentless growls and heavy thuds slowly made them lose their composure. Panic set in when the first dent appeared in the shelter's wall. The bear's hunger made it bold. It slammed its body against the structure, testing its strength. Each impact sent shudders through the floor, shaking loose bits of frost from the ceiling. The shelter, designed to withstand storms and snowdrifts, was no match for a starving polar bear's determination. Laura searched the room for anything they could use as a weapon. They had flares, a utility knife, and a single fire extinguisher. It wasn't enough. She knew it, and so did the others. The next impact was harder and more violent. A crack formed near the base of one wall. The bear had found a weak point. Its claws tore at the edges of the panel, making the screeching sound unbearable. The crack widened, letting in icy air that swirled through the shelter like a death knell. The bear's head appeared through the gap, its black nose twitching as it inhaled their scent. It growled, its breath visible in the frigid air, and began to push its way inside. Laura fired another flare, aiming at the bear's face. The bright burst startled it, but only for a moment. It recoiled, shook its head, and returned with even greater ferocity. The team backed into the far corner, their makeshift weapons clutched tightly. The bear was inside now, its massive body filling the confined space. It roared again, the sound deafening in the enclosed shelter. Laura swung the fire extinguisher, striking its shoulder. The blow glanced off, barely slowing it down. One of the team members tried to stab at it with the utility knife, but the bear swatted him aside like a rag doll. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the floor, unmoving. Another flare went off, this time at point-blank range. The bear roared in pain, but it didn't stop. It couldn't. Hunger had consumed it, leaving no room for fear. Laura's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. There was none. The bear was too strong, too determined. It moved through the shelter with a terrifying purpose, its claws raking against walls and bodies alike. One by one, her team fell, their screams cut short as the bear's weight bore down on them. Finally, it was silent. The shelter was a scene of devastation. Blood smeared the walls, pooling on the icy floor. Equipment lay scattered, broken, and useless. The bear stood amidst the carnage, its sides heaving with exertion. It nosed at the remains, its black eyes dull and lifeless, then proceeded to feed. The wind picked up, howling through the gap in the shelter's wall. It carried away the last traces of life, sweeping over the frozen bay like a cold, indifferent witness. By morning, the storm would cover the tracks, erasing the evidence of what had happened here. The research team was reported missing. A search party found their camp torn apart and scattered across the ice weeks later. But the story of that night, the terror of those final moments, would never truly be known. In the end, only the wind remained. The campfire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the cool night air. Sarah lay in the tent, her sleeping bag zipped tightly around her. Nearby, her brother's breathing was slow and steady, the rhythm of someone deep in sleep. The forest around them was still, with a quiet chorus of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Sarah felt safe. The campsite was familiar terrain, and after years of camping experience, Sarah had taken every precaution to ensure Alex and her would be safe. Their food was stored in a bear-proof container, sealed tight and tucked away from the tent. The only oversight, a small cooler left outside. A careless mistake she hadn't thought twice about, until she heard the sound. It was subtle at first, a muffled scrape that barely registered. Then came the distinct thud of the cooler lid snapping open, followed by the clatter of its contents spilling onto the ground. Sarah's eyes flew open, her body stiff with sudden awareness. She strained her ears, and there it was, a heavy, deliberate snuffling, the unmistakable sound of an animal rooting through their things. Her blood ran cold. She instinctively knew it was a bear. She reached out to Alex, shaking his shoulder, her movements quick but silent. His eyes fluttered open, and she pressed a finger to her lips, motioning for him to stay quiet. He nodded, his face pale in the dim light of the tent. Carefully, Sarah unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moonlight cast long shadows across the campsite. There it was, no more than 15 feet away. A large black bear loomed over the cooler, its massive paws swiping through the scattered contents. Empty wrappers and crushed cans littered the ground. The bear's sheer size was overwhelming, its dark fur blending with the shadows, and its bulk was a stark reminder of its raw power. Sarah's mind raced. They needed to scare it off before it grew more comfortable, or worse, turned its attention to the tent. She grabbed the flashlight beside her sleeping bag and clicked it on, aiming the beam directly at the bear. The bright light startled it, and it paused, lifting its massive head to stare at her. The moment hung in the air, electric with tension. Then, instead of retreating, the bear huffed and took a step closer, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling mix of curiosity and determination. Sarah's stomach dropped. This bear wasn't going to be scared off easily, but Sarah was brave, especially since her brother's life was at stake. She crawled out of the tent, moving slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Staying low, she grabbed a metal pot from their cooking gear and banged it against the flashlight, creating as much noise as possible. The sound echoed through the forest, sharp and jarring. The bear hesitated, its ears flattening briefly, but then it advanced again, its focus unwavering. Sarah backed up, her feet crunching against the gravel as she tried to distance herself from the bear. Her movements were calculated and deliberate, but inside, panic churned. She had to keep it away from the tent, from Alex. Then, in a blur of motion, the bear lunged. Its massive paw swept out, claws extended. Sarah barely had time to react. Pain shot through her leg as the claws raked against her thigh, tearing through fabric and flesh. She stumbled, falling hard onto her back, the flashlight skittering out of her grasp. The bear loomed over her, its breath hot and stinky, its growl vibrating through the ground beneath her. Alex burst from the tent, a sharp cry escaping him as he saw the scene. Before Sarah could shout for him to stay back, he grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it with all his strength. The rock struck the bear's shoulder, not hard enough to injure, but enough to distract. The bear turned, its growl deepening, and for a split second, its attention shifted. "Run!" Sarah's mind screamed, her instincts kicking in. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her leg, and grabbed Alex's arm. Together, they sprinted toward the car parked just beyond the campsite. The bear roared behind them, the sound primal and terrifying, its heavy footfalls pounding against the ground. Sarah's lungs burned, her injured leg screaming with every step, but she didn't dare stop. The car came into view, a lifeline in the darkness. She fumbled for the keys in her pocket, her fingers slick with sweat and shaking uncontrollably. The bear was close, too close. She could feel its presence, its hulking form bearing down on them as they reached the car. She yanked the door open, shoving Alex inside before throwing herself in and slamming the door shut. The bear reached the car a heartbeat later, its massive body slamming against the side with a metallic thud. The vehicle rocked under the impact, the windows vibrating as the bear pawed at the doors. Its growls filled the small space, deafening and relentless. Sarah's hands trembled as she jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. She hit the gas, the tires spinning against the gravel before catching. The car lurched forward, putting distance between them and the enraged bear. In the rearview mirror, she saw it standing in the middle of the road, its dark silhouette illuminated by the red glow of the taillights. It huffed, pawed at the ground, and finally turned back toward the campsite. Sarah didn't stop driving until they reached the ranger station miles away. Only then did she let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her leg throbbed, the wound shallow but bleeding, a stark reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. Alex sat beside her, silent and pale, his wide eyes fixed on the dashboard. As the rangers tended to her injury and began planning to deal with the bear, Sarah's thoughts were consumed by a single, unshakable truth. They had survived, barely. Eric crouched low behind a dense cluster of shrubs, his camera lens trained on the lone grizzly bear rummaging along the riverbank. The golden afternoon light filtered through the pine trees, casting a warm glow over the scene. The bear, a massive creature with a thick coat of dark brown fur, pawed at the gravelly shoreline, flipping rocks in search of fish. Eric's heart pounded with the thrill of being close to one of nature's most powerful predators. This was the shot he had been waiting for. For 3 days, he tracked signs of bear activity in the backcountry of Wyoming, scattered paw prints in the mud, claw marks on tree trunks, and the occasional clump of fur snagged on branches had led him to this spot. His persistence had paid off. As the bear moved along the riverbank, Eric adjusted his position to get a better angle. He edged forward, careful to stay downwind, the crunch of his boots muffled by the soft moss beneath him. He knew the risks of getting too close, but reasoned that he was far enough away to avoid alarming the animal. Through the viewfinder, he snapped a series of shots, the bear's every movement captured in perfect detail. But then the bear stopped, its massive head lifted, ears swiveling as it sniffed the air. Eric froze, holding his breath. The bear turned, its dark eyes locking onto him through the foliage. The seconds stretched, a taut silence filling the space between predator and intruder. Eric's heart raced, his pulse drumming loudly in his ears. He slowly backed away, trying to create distance, but his foot slipped on a loose rock in his haste to retreat. The sharp clatter echoed through the trees. The bear growled a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the ground. It stood on its hind legs, its full height towering over Eric, and swung its head back and forth, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Eric's stomach sank. He had trapped the bear between the river and the thick brush behind him. There was no escape for either of them. The bear dropped to all fours and charged. Eric's survival instincts kicked in, and he bolted for the nearest tree. His legs burned as he scrambled up the trunk, the rough bark biting into his palms. Below, the grizzly closed the distance with terrifying speed, its claws ripping into the earth as it barreled forward. Eric reached for the next branch, his hands trembling, but the bear was too fast. With a roar, it rose on its hind legs and swiped at him. The impact was brutal. The bear's paw struck Eric's side, knocking him from the tree and sending him crashing to the ground. He hit the earth, the wind knocked out of him. Dazed and gasping, he struggled to roll onto his stomach, but the bear was faster. Eric's mind raced, grasping for anything that might save him. He remembered the advice he'd read countless times in survival guides. Play dead. His body went limp. His arms splayed out as he pressed his face into the dirt. Every instinct screamed at him to fight back, to run, but he forced himself to remain still. The bear growled again, a sound so close it seemed to rattle his bones. He felt its hot breath against his neck, a disgusting mix of fish and decay. The bear's nose pressed against him, snuffling as it investigated this new threat. Its massive paw prodded at his back, flipping him onto his side. Eric kept his eyes closed, his breath shallow, even as the bear's claws grazed his skin, tearing through his jacket and leaving stinging gashes on his chest and arms. The weight of the bear was crushing. It pawed at his legs, pressing down hard enough to bruise, then bit at the straps of his backpack, yanking him sideways. Eric's muscles screamed in protest but stayed limp, his body slack and motionless. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The bear huffed and circled him, its frustration obvious. Eric's heart pounded so hard he feared the bear could hear it. He dared not open his eyes, even as the animal nudged him with its nose one last time. Finally, the grizzly let out a low, rumbling exhale. Eric heard the heavy crunch of its paws retreating, the sound growing fainter as it moved back toward the river. He waited, every muscle locked in place until he could no longer hear the bear's movements. Only then did he open his eyes. Pain radiated through his body as he struggled to sit up. Blood soaked through his shirt, the gashes on his torso oozing dark red. His side throbbed where the bear had struck him, likely fracturing a rib or two. His camera lay a few feet away, its lens shattered, a cruel reminder of how close he had come to capturing the perfect shot and how close he had come to dying. Eric staggered to his feet, clutching at the tree for support. His surroundings spun, his vision blurred by exhaustion and adrenaline. He knew he couldn't stay here. The bear might return, and he was in no condition to face it again. He stumbled along the riverbank, his movements slow and unsteady. Each step sent jolts of pain through his battered body, but he pressed on, driven by the faint hope of finding help. After what felt like an eternity, he heard voices, distant but unmistakable. A group of hikers appeared, their faces a mix of concern and shock as they rushed to his aid. They helped him to a makeshift seat, wrapped his wounds, and gave him water. One radioed for assistance, and Eric was airlifted to safety within hours. Eric gazed down at the forest below as the helicopter lifted him from the wilderness. The riverbank where the encounter had unfolded was a small, insignificant speck in the vast expanse of wilderness. The bear, somewhere down there, continued its hunt for survival, just as he had fought for his. The dense canopy of the Adirondacks filtered sunlight into scattered beams, casting long shadows over the forest floor. James moved carefully along the rugged trail, his hiking boots crunching against loose stones and fallen leaves. Miles from the nearest road, he finally enjoyed the solitude he craved. His pack was light, his steps confident, and the only sound was the rustle of wind through the trees. Barely 30 yards ahead, a black bear stood on its hind legs, its broad head buried in a thick patch of berry bushes. James froze mid-step, his heart thundering in his chest. The bear's coat shone jet black, its muscles rippling under its fur. It hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on stripping the bush clean of its small red fruit. James began to back away slowly, his body tense, his breaths shallow. His mind raced through everything he'd read about bear encounters. No sudden movements, no loud noises. Make yourself appear non-threatening. Each step back felt like an eternity. The forest suddenly alive with every snapping twig and crunch of undergrowth. But when his boot caught on a loose rock, sending it skittering down the slope with a sharp clatter, James knew he was out of luck. And when the bear's head snapped up and its dark eyes locked onto James, unblinking, the man knew he was in deep trouble. The animal dropped to all fours, its posture low and predatory. A growl rumbled from its chest. James felt rooted to the spot, his muscles frozen in terror. James spun and bolted, his legs carrying him blindly through the dense forest. Branches whipped at his face, and the uneven terrain threatened to send him sprawling. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the bear barreling toward him, closing the distance with each thundering step. Desperation clawed at him as he spotted a tree with thick, low branches. His instinct screamed at him to climb. Reaching the base, he threw himself at the trunk, gripping the rough bark as he hauled himself up. His arms burned, and his fingers slipped on the mossy surface, but adrenaline drove him upward. The sound of snapping branches below told him the bear was following. James reached a sturdy branch and pulled himself onto it, panting, his chest heaving. But when he looked down, his heart sank. The bear was already climbing, its massive claws easily digging into the bark, its teeth bared as it growled, saliva dripping from its jaws. James gripped his hiking stick, the only weapon he had. As the bear lunged closer, he swung it with all his strength. The stick connected with the bear's snout, the crack echoing through the forest. The bear roared in pain. Its grip faltered, and it slid down the trunk, clawing to regain footing. James didn't wait to see if it would recover. He scrambled higher, his arms and legs trembling. The bear growled again but didn't follow. Instead, it dropped to the ground, pacing in agitated circles. James clung to the tree, his chest heaving, his hands trembling around the stick. His pulse hammered in his ears as he watched the bear retreat into the shadows, growling one last time before disappearing into the forest. James allowed himself to breathe deeply when the forest grew silent again. His body throbbed with pain, his arms from climbing, his ribs where a branch had jabbed him during his frantic ascent. He looked down at his scattered gear, much of it tossed in his panicked flight. His pack was torn open, its contents strewn across the ground. The bear had ripped through it, and his food was gone. He climbed down cautiously, his legs wobbling as they touched the ground. The stick, splintered from the impact, was still clutched in his hand. He scanned the area for any sign of the bear. The woods were eerily quiet, but he knew better than to trust the silence. James gathered what he could: a half-empty water bottle, an emergency blanket, and a small knife that had miraculously strapped to his belt. He found a patch of clear ground and set to work, his mind racing through survival techniques. His hands shook as he gathered fallen branches and lashed them together to form a crude shelter against a rocky outcrop. It was far from perfect, but it offered some semblance of protection. Night fell quickly, the forest plunging into darkness. James sat under the makeshift shelter, his body stiff with tension. Every sound, every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent his pulse racing. He kept the broken hiking stick by his side, clutching the knife in his other hand. With trembling fingers, the fire he managed to light offered little comfort, its small flames casting flickering shadows that seemed to move independently. The hours dragged on. Sleep was impossible. James's mind replayed the encounter, the bear's roar, the flash of its teeth, the crushing weight of its presence. He stayed vigilant, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Dawn broke slowly, the pale light filtering through the trees. Exhausted and aching, James packed what little he had left and began the trek back toward the trailhead. Every step felt like a risk. Every rustle in the bushes a potential threat. His senses were heightened, his body primed to run at the slightest sign of danger. As he neared a clearing, he heard voices, human voices. Relief flooded through him as he stumbled into a group of hikers, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity as they saw his torn clothes and battered face. One radioed for help, and James was soon escorted out of the wilderness. The weight of his ordeal didn't fully hit him until he was safely in the back of a rescue vehicle, the dense forest shrinking in the rear-view mirror. The image of the bear stayed with him, its eyes, its growl, the raw power that had come so close to ending him. He survived, but the wilderness had left its mark, a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. And as the adrenaline faded, James couldn't shake the feeling that the bear, somewhere deep in the Adirondacks, remembered him too.